Sales have changed more in the last 10 years than it did over the previous 100. About a year ago, in a moment of procrastination masquerading as an act of reflection, the author decided to examine how he spends his time. He opened his laptop, clicked on the carefully synced, color-coded calendar, and attempted to reconstruct what he'd actually done over the previous 2 weeks. He cataloged the meetings attended, trips made, meals eaten, and conference calls endured. He tried to list everything he'd read and watched as well as all the face-to-face conversations he'd had with family, friends, and colleagues. Then he inspected 2 weeks of digital entrails, 772 sent emails, 4 blog posts, 83 tweets, about a dozen text messages. He stepped back to assess this welter of information, a pointillist portrait of what he does and, therefore, in some sense, who he is. The picture that stared back was a surprise. He is a salesman. He does not sell minivans in a car dealership or bound from office to office, pressing cholesterol drugs on physicians. But leave aside sleep, exercise and hygiene, and it turns out that he spends a significant portion of his days trying to coax others to part with resources. Sometimes he is trying to tempt people to purchase books he has written. But most of what he does do not directly make a cash register ring. You're probably not much different. Dig beneath the sprouts of your own calendar entries and examine their roots, and you'll discover something similar. Some of you, no doubt, are selling in the literal sense, convincing existing customers and fresh prospects to buy casualty insurance or consulting services or homemade pies at a farmer's market. But all of you are likely spending more time than you realize selling in a broader sense, pitching colleagues, persuading funders, cajoling kids. Like it or not, we're all in sales now. And most people, upon hearing this, don't like it much at all. Sales? To the smart set, sales is an endeavor that requires little intellectual throw weight, a task for slick glad-handers who skate through life on a shoeshine and a smile. To others, it's the province of dodgy characters doing slippery things, a realm where trickery and deceit get the speaking parts while honesty and fairness watch mutely from the rafters. Still, others view it as the white-collar equivalent of cleaning toilets, necessary perhaps, but unpleasant and even a bit unclean. We've gotten it wrong. This is a book about sales. But it is unlike any book about sales you have read or ignored before. That's because selling in all its dimensions, whether pushing Buicks on a car lot or pitching ideas in a meeting, has changed more in the last 10 years than it did over the previous 100. Most of what we think we understand about selling are constructed atop a foundation of assumptions that has crumbled. Sales is an important part of labor markets around the world, and the need for salespeople has increased over the years. Deep inside a thick semi-annual report from the Occupational Employment Statistics Program of the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics lurks a surprising, and surprisingly significant, piece of data: 1 out of every 9 American workers works in sales. Each day more than 15 million people earn their keep by trying to convince someone else to make a purchase. They are real estate brokers, industrial sales representatives, and securities dealers. They sell planes to airlines, trains to city governments, and automobiles to prospective drivers at more than 10,000 dealerships across the country. Some work in posh offices with glorious views, others in dreary cubicles with Dilbert cartoons, and a free calendar. But they all sell, from multi-million-dollar consulting agreements to $10 magazine subscriptions and everything in between. Consider the United States manufacturing economy, still the largest in the world, cranks out nearly $2 trillion worth of goods each year. But the United States has far more salespeople than factory workers. Americans love complaining about bloated governments, but America's sales force outnumbers the entire federal workforce by more than 5 to 1. The U.S. private sector employs 3 times as many salespeople as all 50 state governments combined employ people. If the nation's salespeople lived in a single state, that state would be the 50 largest in the United States. The presence of so many salespeople in the planet's largest economy seems peculiar given the 2 seismic economic events of the last decade: the implosion of the global financial system and the explosion of widespread internet connectivity. To be sure, sales, like almost every other type of work, were caught in the downdraft of the Great Recession. Between 2006 and 2010, some 1.1 million U.S. sales jobs disappeared. Yet even after the worst downturn in a half-century, sales remain the second largest occupational category, behind the office and administration workers, in the American workforce, just as it has been for decades. What's more, the Bureau of Labor Statistics projects that the United States will add nearly 2 million new sales jobs by 2020. Likewise, the Internet has not had nearly the effect on sales that many predicted. Between 2000 and today, the very period that broadband, smartphones, and e-commerce ascended to disintermediate salespeople and obviate the need for selling, the total number of sales jobs increased, and the portion of the U.S. workforce in sales has remained exactly the same, 1 in 9. What holds for the United States holds equally for the rest of the world. For example, in Canada, sales and service occupations, a broader category than the United States uses, constitute slightly more than 25% of the Canadian workforce. Australian Bureau of Statistics census data shows that about 10% of Australia's labour force falls under the heading sales workers. In the United Kingdom, which uses yet another set of occupation categories, adding up the jobs that involve selling, for example, sales accounts and business development managers and vehicle and parts salespersons or advisors and so on, totals about 3 million workers out of a workforce of roughly 30 million, or again, about 1 in 10. In the entire European Union, the figure is slightly higher. According to the most recent available data along with calculations by officials at Eurostat, the EU's statistical agency, about 13% of the region's more than 200 million person labor force works in sales. Taken together, the data show that rather than a decline in relevance and size, sales have remained a stalwart part of labor markets around the world. Even as advanced economies have transformed, from hard goods and heavy lifting to skilled services and conceptual thinking, the need for salespeople has not abated. Why more of us find ourselves in sales? The rise of small entrepreneurs. It's easy to poke fun at a place like Brooklyn Brine. The company sells artisanal pickled vegetables. No, really. It's located in Brooklyn. And the people who work there freely use terms like lavender asparagus, garlic scape, and vegan blogger. But ventures like this, 1 owner, 10 employees, 14 varieties of a pickle, are becoming an integral part of the current economy. In the process, they're placing new importance on selling in all its dimensions. Brooklyn Brine embodies the first of 3 reasons why more of us find ourselves in sales: the rise of small entrepreneurs. When we think of the differences between very large enterprises and very small ones, we often focus on differences in degree. The former, by definition, has more revenue, more customers, and more employees. But equally important are differences in kind. What people actually do inside tiny operations is often fundamentally different from what they do within massive ones. In particular, large organizations tend to rely on specialization. A 2-person company doesn't need a human resources department. A 2,000-person company can't survive without one. In bigger companies, selling is often a specialized function, a department, a division, a task that some people do so that others can specialize in something else. But proprietors of small operations don't have that luxury. They must wear several hats, often at the same time, and one of these hats is the selling cap. Elasticity, the new breadth of skills demanded by established companies. Now meet another guy who runs a company, Mike Cannon-Brookes. His business, Atlassian, is older and much larger than Brooklyn Brine. But what's happening inside is both consistent with and connected to its tinier counterpart. Atlassian builds what are called enterprise software, large, complex packages that businesses and governments use to manage projects, track progress, and foster collaboration among employees. Launched a decade ago by Cannon, Brookes and Scott Farquhar upon their graduation from Australia's University of New South Wales, Atlassian now has some 1,200 customers in 53 countries, among them Microsoft, Air New Zealand, Samsung, and the United Nations. Its revenue last year was $100 million. But unlike most of its competitors, Atlassian collected that entire amount, $100 million in sales, without a single salesperson. Selling without a sales force sounds like confirmation of the death of a salesman meme. But Cannon-Brookes, the company's CEO, sees it differently. "We have no salespeople," he said, because, in a weird way, everyone is a salesperson. Here potential customers typically initiate the relationship themselves by downloading a trial version of one of the company's products. Some of them then call Atlassian's support staff with questions. But the employees who offer support, unlike a traditional sales force, don't tempt callers with fast expiring discounts or badger them to make a long-term commitment. Instead, they simply help people understand the software, knowing that the value and elegance of their assistance can move wavering buyers to make a purchase. The same goes for engineers. Their job, of course, is to build great software, but that demands more than just slinging code. It also requires discovering customers' needs, understanding how the products are used, and building something so unique and exciting that someone will be moved to buy. "We try to espouse the philosophy that everyone the customer touches is effectively a salesperson," says Cannon-Brookes. At Atlassian, sales, in this case, traditional sales, isn't anyone's job. It's everyone's job. And that paradoxical arrangement is becoming more common. Ed-Med. Education and health care are realms we often associate with caring, helping and other softer virtues, but they have more in common with the sharp-edged world of selling than we realize. To sell well is to convince someone else to part with resources, not to deprive that person, but to leave him better off in the end. That is also what, say, a good algebra teacher does. At the beginning of a term, students don't know much about the subject. But the teacher works to convince his class to part with resources, time, attention, effort, and if they do, they will be better off when the term ends than they were when it began. "I never thought of myself as a salesman, but I have come to the realization that we all are," says Holly Witt-Payton, a 6th-grade science teacher in Louisiana. "I'm selling my students that the science lesson I'm teaching them is the most interesting thing ever," which is something Payton firmly believes. The same is true in health care. For instance, a physical therapist helping someone recover from injury needs that person to hand over resources, again, time, attention, and effort, because doing so, painful though it can be, will leave the patient healthier than if he'd kept the resources to himself. "Medicine involves a lot of salesmanships," says one internist who prefers not to be named. "I have to talk people into doing some fairly unpleasant things. What do people really think about sales?" To find out, the author turned to an effective, and often underused, methodology. He asked them. As part of the "What do you do at work?" survey, he posed the following question to respondents: when you think of sales or selling, what's the first word that comes to mind? The most common answer was money, and the 10 most frequent responses included words like pitch, marketing, and persuasion. But when he combed through the list and removed the nouns, most of which were value-neutral synonyms for selling, an interesting picture emerged. Pushy was the most frequent adjective or interjection and the fourth most mentioned word overall, thus its impressive size. Smarmy, essential, and important are tinier because they were mentioned less often. Adjectives and interjections can reveal people's attitudes since they often contain an emotional component that nouns lack. And the emotions elicited by sales or selling carry an unmistakable flavor. Of the 25 most offered words, only 5 have a positive valence: necessary, challenging, fun, essential, and important. The remainders are all negative. These negative words assemble into 2 camps. A few reflect people's discomfort with selling: tough, difficult, hard, painful, but most reflect their distaste. Words like pushy and aggressive figure prominently, along with a batch of adjectives that suggest deception: slimy, smarmy, sleazy, dishonest, manipulative, and fake. These words, a linguistic MRI of our brains contemplating sales, capture a common view. Selling makes many of us uncomfortable and even a bit disgusted, ick, yuck, in part because we believe that its practice revolves around duplicity, dissembling, and double-dealing. To probe people's impressions further, he asked a related question, one better suited to visual thinkers: when you think of sales or selling, what's the first picture that comes to mind? Respondents had to describe their picture in 5 or fewer words. The responses, in overwhelming numbers, took a distinct form. They involved a man in a suit selling a car, generally a used one. The top 5 responses, by a wide margin, were car salesman, suit, used, car salesman, man in a suit, and our old friend, pushy. The top 10 also included both car and used car on their own. The image that formed in respondents' minds was uniformly male. The word man even made the top 25. Very few people used the gender-neutral term salesperson, and nobody answered saleswoman. Many respondents emphasized the sociable aspects of sales, with outgoing, extrovert, and talker, all making the top 25. Others settled on more metaphorical or literary images, including shark and Willy Loman, and some people still couldn't resist offering adjectives: slick, sleazy, and annoying. It turns out that these sets of responses, taken together, can help us puncture one of the most pervasive myths about selling in all its forms. The belief that sales are distasteful because it's deceitful isn't so much inherently wrong as they are woefully outdated. Effective perspective taking and attuning yourself are the heart of moving others today. Take a moment right now, and if there's someone in the room with you, politely request 30 seconds of his or her time. Then ask that person to do the following. First, with your dominant hand, snap your fingers 5 times as quickly as you can. Then, again, as quickly as you can, use the forefinger of your dominant hand to draw a capital E on your forehead. Seriously, go ahead and do this. Now look at the way your counterpart drew his or her E. What does it look like? The difference might seem innocuous, but the letter on your counterpart's forehead offers a window into his mind. Does the E resemble one that the person drew so he could read it himself? Or does it look like the one he drew so you could read it? Since the mid-1980s, social psychologists have used this technique, call it the E-test, to measure what they dub perspective taking. When confronted with an unusual or complex situation involving other people, how do we make sense of what's going on? Do we examine it only from our own point of view? Or do we have the capability to step outside our own experience and imagine the emotions, perceptions, and motivations of another? Perspective taking is at the heart of our first essential quality in moving others today. Attunement is the ability to bring one's actions and outlook into harmony with other people and with the context you're in. Think of it as operating the dial on a radio. It's the capacity to move up and down the band as circumstances demand, locking in on what's being transmitted, even if those signals aren't immediately clear or obvious. Research shows that effective perspective taking, attuning yourself with others, hinges on 3 principles. 1. Increase your power by reducing it. In a fascinating study a few years ago, a team of social scientists led by Adam Galinsky at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management probed the relationship between perspective taking and power. They divided their participants into 2 groups, the only difference being what each experienced immediately before the key experiment. One group completed a series of exercises that induced feelings of power. The other did a different set of activities designed to emphasize their lack of power. Then, researchers gave the people in each group the E-test. The results were unmistakable. High-power participants were almost 3 times as likely as low-power participants to draw a self-oriented E. In other words, those who'd received even a small injection of power became less likely and perhaps less able to attune themselves to someone else's point of view. 2. Use your head as much as your heart. Social scientists often view perspective taking and empathy as fraternal twins, closely related, but not identical. Perspective taking is a cognitive capacity, it's mostly about thinking. Empathy is an emotional response, it's mostly about feeling. Both are crucial. But Galinsky, William Maddox at INSEAD Business School in Fontainebleau, France, and 2 additional colleagues have found that one is more effective when it comes to moving others. In a 2008 experiment, the researchers simulated a negotiation over the sale of a gas station. Like many real-life negotiations, this one presented what looked like an obstacle. The highest price the buyer would pay was less than the lowest price the seller would accept. However, the parties had other mutual interests that, if surfaced, could lead to a deal both would accept. 1/3 of the negotiators were instructed to imagine what the other side was feeling, while 1/3 was instructed to imagine what the other side was thinking. The remaining third, given bland and generic instructions, was the control group. What happened? The empathizers struck many more deals than the control group. But the prospective takers did even better. 76% of them managed to fashion a deal that satisfied both sides. 3. Mimic strategically. In an award-winning study, Galinsky and Maddox, along with Stanford University's Elizabeth Mullen, tested whether mimicry deepened attunement and enhanced the ability to move others. They used the same scenarios as in the previous study, the gas station sale and the negotiation between a job hunter and a recruiter, but added a new dimension. 5 minutes before the exercise began, some of the participants received an important message that gave them additional instructions for carrying out their assignment. Successful negotiators recommend that you should mimic the mannerisms of your negotiation partner to get a better deal. For example, when the other person rubs his/her face, you should too. If he/she leans back or leans forward in the chair, you should too. However, they say it is very important that you mimic subtly enough that the other person does not notice what you are doing, otherwise, this technique completely backfires. Also, do not direct too much of your attention to the mimicking, so you don't lose focus on the outcome of the negotiation. Thus, you should find a happy medium of consistent but subtle mimicking that does not disrupt your focus. Strategic mimicry proved to be effective. The participants told to mimic, again, with just 5 minutes of notice and preparation, did it surprisingly well and to great effect. Negotiators who mimicked their opponent's mannerisms were more likely to create a deal that benefited both parties. Clarity, the capacity to help others see their situations in revealing ways and to identify problems they didn't realize they had. Forgive the intrusion into your personal affairs, but let me ask, are you saving enough for retirement? If you're like many people, your answer is a quiet and sheepish, probably not. Around the world, but especially in the United States, the number of individuals who haven't made adequate preparations for their golden years stands somewhere between grim and alarming. About half of U.S. households are financially unprepared for their breadwinners to retire at age 65. 3 in 4 Americans have less than $30,000 saved in their retirement accounts. It's not entirely our fault. Partly because our brains evolved at a time when the future itself was perilous, we human beings are notoriously bad at wrapping our minds around far-off events. Our biases point us toward the present. So when given a choice between an immediate reward, say, $1,000 right now, and a reward we have to wait for, $1,150 in 2 years, we'll often take the former even when it's in our own interest to choose the latter. Hal Hirschfield, a social psychologist at New York University, thought the barrier to moving people to save for retirement might be something else altogether. Working with 6 far-flung colleagues, he conducted a series of studies to test a different hypothesis. In one experiment, Hirschfield and the team had each of their participants strap on a virtual reality headset. Half the participants saw a digital representation of themselves, an avatar, for about a minute and then had a brief conversation with a digital representation of a researcher. The other half also saw an avatar of themselves through the headset. But for this group, researchers used a computer software package that ages a face to create an avatar that showed what the participant would look like at age 70. This group gazed at the 70-year-old version of themselves for about a minute and then had the same brief conversation with the researcher's avatar. Afterward, the experimenters gave both groups a money allocation task. Imagine, they told the participants that you've just received an unexpected $1,000. How would you allocate the money among the following 4 options? Use it to buy something nice for someone special. Invest it in a retirement fund. Plan a fun and extravagant occasion. Put it in a checking account. Those who saw images of their current selves, call them the Me Now group, directed an average of $80 into the retirement account. Those who saw images of their future selves, the Me Later group, allocated more than twice that amount, $172.30. To determine more precisely what was driving the discrepancy in response, whether it was the sight of their own aging face or the reminder of aging in general, the researchers tried a similar experiment with a different set of participants. This time, half the participants saw an age-morphed image of themselves, Me Later, and half saw an age-morphed image of someone else, You Later. The results weren't even close. Those who saw the image of themselves at age 70 saved more than those who'd simply seen a picture of a 70-year-old. When researchers conducted similar experiments using equipment less complicated than an immersive virtual reality environment, the pattern held. The Me Later group always saved more. The problem we have saving for retirement, these studies showed, isn't only our meager ability to weigh present rewards against future ones. It is also the connection, or rather, the disconnection, between our present and future selves. Hirschfield and his colleagues discovered that trying to solve an existing problem, getting people to balance better short-term and long-term rewards, was insufficient because it wasn't the problem that most needed solving. The researchers' breakthrough was to identify a new and previously unknown problem, that we think of ourselves today and ourselves in the future as different people. Once they identified that alternative problem, they were able to fashion a solution, show people an image of themselves getting old. And that, in turn, addressed the broader concern, namely, encouraging people to save more money for retirement. The successors to the elevator pitch won. The one-word pitch, the ultimate pitch for an era of short attention spans, begins with a single word, and doesn't go any further. The one-word pitch derives in part from Maurice Saatchi, who, with his brother Charles, founded the advertising agencies Saatchi and M&C Saatchi. For several years, Saatchi has been touting what he calls one-word equity. In this model, companies compete for global ownership of one word in the public mind, Saatchi writes. The company's aim and the aim of this type of pitch is to define the one characteristic they most want to be associated with their brand around the world and then own it. That is one-word equity. When anybody thinks of you, they utter that word. When anybody utters that word, they think of you. Point 2. The question pitch. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was running for President of the United States in a grim economy. Unseating an incumbent, even one as vulnerable as then-President Jimmy Carter, who'd been elected in 1976, is never easy. So Reagan had to make the case that Carter's poor stewardship of the economy required the country to change leadership. In his pitch to voters, Reagan could have delivered a declarative statement, "Your economic situation has deteriorated over the last 48 months." And he could have supported the assertion with a slew of data on the nation's spiraling inflation and steep unemployment. Instead, Reagan asked a question: "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago, by making people work just a little harder?" Question pitches prompt people to come up with their own reasons for agreeing or not. And when people summon their own reasons for believing something, they endorse the belief more strongly and become more likely to act on it. Point 3. The rhyming pitch. If you're testifying before your city council, summarizing your main point with a rhyme gives council members a way to talk about your proposal when they deliberate. If you're one of a series of freelancers invited to make a presentation before a big potential client, including a rhyme can enhance the processing fluency of your listeners, allowing your message to stick in their minds when they compare you and your competitors. Pitches that rhyme are more sublime. Point 4. The subject line pitch. Email has become so integrated into our lives that, as Xerox PARC researchers describe, it has become more like a habit than an application. But as with any habit, the more deeply we're immersed in it, the less we notice its distinctive features. That's why many of us haven't realized that every email we send is a pitch. It's a plea for someone's attention and an invitation to engage. Whether somebody accepts that invitation or even opens the email at all depends most on who sent it. You're more likely to look at a message from your boss or your girlfriend than from a company you've never heard of promising a product you'll never need. But the next most important element in email engagement is the subject line, the headline that previews and promises what the message contains. Conclusion. Now that you have seen the very act of selling in a new light. Selling is more urgent, more important, and, in its own sweet way, more beautiful than we realize. The ability to move others to exchange what they have for what we have is crucial to our survival and our happiness. It has helped our species evolve, lifted our living standards, and enhanced our daily lives. The capacity to sell isn't some unnatural adaptation to the merciless world of commerce. It is part of who we are. Selling is fundamentally human. Practice strategic mimicry. The 3 key steps are watch, wait, and wane. 1. Watch. Observe what the other person is doing. How is he sitting? Are his legs crossed? His arms? Does he lean back? Tilt to one side? Tap his toe? Twirl his pen? How does he speak? Fast? Slow? Does he favor particular expressions? 2. Wait. Once you've observed, don't spring immediately into action. Let the situation breathe. If he leans back, count to 15, then consider leaning back too. If he makes an important point, repeat back the main idea verbatim, but a bit later in the conversation. Don't do this too many times, though. It's not a contest in which you're piling up points per mimic. 3. Wane. After you've mimicked a little, try to be less conscious of what you're doing. Remember, this is something that humans, including you, do naturally, so at some point, it will begin to feel effortless. It's like driving a car. When you first learn, you have to be conscious and deliberate. But once you've acquired some experience, you can proceed by instinct. The objective here isn't to be false. It's to be strategic, by being human. Subtle mimicry comes across as a form of flattery, the physical dance of charm itself. The New York Times has noted. And if that kind of flattery doesn't close a deal, it may just be that the customer isn't buying.